The candles had barely settled into their steady glow when the doors of the dining hall opened, and a woman no one at that table expected walked in on the arm of the Duke himself. Alina Hartley did not look up right away. She was seated at the head of the long table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for the first course to arrive, when she heard the footsteps stop beside her husband's chair instead of continuing past it. She heard the low murmur that swept the room, the way silk rustled as guests turned in their seats, the way forks paused halfway to mouths. She heard her husband, Duke Reginald Hartley, clear his throat. "My dear friends," he said, his voice carrying that easy confidence he always wore like a second coat, "allow me to introduce Lady Vivienne Sinclair. She will be joining us this evening." Alina lifted her eyes then, slowly, the way a woman lifts her eyes when she already knows exactly what she will see and has decided, in the space of a single breath, exactly how she will respond. Vivienne Sinclair was younger than Alina by perhaps 8 years, dressed in a gown the color of crushed plums, her dark hair pinned with small pearls that caught the candlelight every time she moved. She was beautiful in the obvious way, the way that made men stumble over their words and made other women grip their wine glasses a little tighter. She stood beside Reginald's chair as though she had every right to be there, her chin lifted, her smile polite but watchful, studying Alina's face for the crack she expected to find. The room had gone very quiet. Lord Ashcombe, seated to Alina's right, had frozen with his glass halfway to his lips. Across the table, Lady Prescott's fan stopped its slow, steady motion. Even the footmen along the wall seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the moment when the Duchess of Camden would rise from her chair, or weep, or say something sharp enough to cut the air in half. Alina did none of these things. She looked at Vivienne Sinclair the same way she might look at any guest arriving late to a dinner she had planned for weeks, and she said, in a voice as calm and clear as a bell across still water, "Good evening." 2 words, that was all. She did not smile, but she did not frown either. Her expression was pleasant, composed, entirely unreadable, and then she turned back to her plate and lifted her spoon as the first course, a pale golden soup, was set before her. For a moment nothing happened at all. The silence stretched thin enough that it seemed it might snap and fill the room with something loud and ugly. Reginald stood frozen beside his own chair, his hand still resting on the back of it, his mouth slightly open as though he had prepared himself for tears, for a scene, for something he could manage and explain away later with a sigh and a shake of his head to his friends at the club. He had not prepared himself for 2 ordinary words spoken in an ordinary tone, as though nothing at all unusual had occurred. Vivienne's smile faltered just slightly, just at the corners, before she caught herself and let Reginald guide her to the empty chair that had been set 2 places down from Alina. It had not escaped anyone's notice that a place had been prepared for her in advance. This had not been a surprise to the household. It had been planned. The dinner continued, because dinners always continue. The soup was followed by roasted pheasant, and the pheasant by a dish of buttered vegetables from the estate's own gardens, and throughout it all, the conversation limped along in careful, polite fragments, guests speaking a little too brightly about the weather, about the upcoming autumn hunt, about anything that was not the woman in the plum-colored gown sitting near the Duchess, as though this were the most natural arrangement in the world. Alina ate her soup. She asked Lord Ashcombe about his daughter's upcoming wedding and listened with genuine attention as he described the flowers being ordered from the coast. She complimented the cook, quietly, when the pheasant was brought out, noting that the sauce had been improved since the last time it was served. She behaved in every visible way exactly as she always behaved at these dinners, gracious, attentive, unhurried. But those who knew her best, and there were a few at that table who did, noticed something else. They noticed that her hand, when she reached for her wine glass, did not shake. They noticed that she did not once glance toward Vivienne Sinclair, not out of fear or avoidance, but because she seemed to have already decided that the woman did not warrant her attention. And they noticed, most of all, the small, private curve at the edge of Alina's mouth when Reginald, several minutes later, tried to catch her eye across the table and found that she was not looking for his. Vivienne, for her part, had expected something different. She had imagined in the days leading up to this dinner that the Duchess would be humiliated, that she might excuse herself early, or that her eyes would fill with tears she would struggle to hide. Vivienne had rehearsed her own expression for such a moment, a look of gentle sympathy layered carefully over quiet triumph. She had not rehearsed for indifference. She found herself, halfway through the meal, glancing toward Alina more than she meant to, searching for some sign of the wound she had been promised was there. She found none. Reginald, too, kept looking at his wife, though he tried to disguise it by turning his attention to his neighbors, laughing a beat too loudly at a joke Lord Ashcombe made about the price of grain. He had married Alina 10 years earlier, in a match arranged by their fathers over matters of land and title, and in all that time he had come to know her as a woman of quiet efficiency and careful manners, but he had never quite learned to read what lay beneath them. Tonight, for the first time in years, he found himself wondering if he had ever truly understood his wife at all. The dessert course arrived, a dish of poached pears dusted with sugar, and it was then that Lady Prescott, unable to bear the strange tension any longer, leaned toward Alina and asked, in a voice pitched just low enough to seem private and just loud enough to be heard by half the table, whether the Duchess was quite well. "I am very well, thank you," Alina answered, setting down her spoon. "The pears are lovely this year. I believe it was the dry summer that did it." Lady Prescott blinked, clearly having expected a different sort of answer, and murmured something about the weather before retreating into her own dessert. By the time the final course had been cleared, and the guests began to rise from the table, drifting toward the drawing-room for coffee and quiet conversation, the mood in the hall had shifted from shock into something more uncertain, a kind of nervous curiosity that followed Alina as she moved gracefully among her guests. She thanked each of them for coming. She asked after their families. She behaved, in every way that mattered to the watching eyes of society, exactly as a duchess should behave. It was only when the last of the guests had gone, when the candles had burned low and the great house had settled into its late evening hush, that Alina allowed herself to walk to her private sitting room instead of the chamber she shared, in name only, with her husband. She closed the door behind her. She stood for a long moment in the quiet, the sounds of the departing carriages fading into the distance beyond her window. Only then did her shoulders drop, just slightly, the careful posture she had held all evening loosening by a fraction of an inch. She was not crying. She had not cried in a very long time, not over Reginald, not over the whispers she knew would follow her name through every drawing-room in London by the end of the week. She walked to her writing desk instead, lit a second candle, and drew a sheet of paper toward her. She did not yet know what she would write, but she knew, with a certainty that had been building quietly inside her for longer than tonight, that something had shifted in her tonight, something that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with a decision she had been circling for months without quite letting herself land on it. Downstairs, in the drawing-room he had claimed for himself since Alina had stopped joining him there in the evenings, Reginald Hartley poured himself a second glass of brandy and stared into the fire, turning over the 2 words his wife had spoken at dinner, unable to shake the feeling that he had somehow, without understanding how, lost something important tonight, and that whatever it was not coming back the way he expected it to. Vivienne Sinclair, riding home in her own carriage through the dark London streets, found herself equally unsettled, replaying the Duchess's calm voice again and again, searching for the fear or grief she had been promised would be there, and finding, each time, only the quiet, unshakable steadiness of a woman who had not been surprised at all. None of them, not Reginald, not Vivienne, not even the guests who had witnessed it firsthand, understood yet what that evening had truly set in motion. They believed they had watched a humiliation quietly absorbed. What they had actually watched, though none of them could see it yet, was the opening move of a woman who had spent 10 years learning exactly how her husband's world worked, and who had just decided, in the space of 2 calm words, that she was finally ready to use that knowledge for herself. The candles in the great house burned down through the night, one by one, until only the one on Alina's writing desk remained lit, and the paper before her, when the household finally rose the next morning, was covered edge to edge with careful, deliberate handwriting that no one else had yet seen. By the second morning after the dinner, the story had already traveled well beyond the walls of the Hartley estate. It moved the way stories of that kind always moved among the wealthy families of London, passed first in whispers between maids polishing silver, then repeated over breakfast tables by daughters eager to share what they had heard, then finally spoken aloud, quite openly, in the drawing rooms where ladies gathered each afternoon to drink tea and discuss the lives of everyone but themselves. Lady Prescott, who had been present at the dinner, told the story to no fewer than 6 different friends within 2 days, and each time she told it, the details grew slightly larger, slightly more dramatic, until by the end of the week, some versions of the tale had Alina Hartley fainting at the table, while others insisted she had thrown her wine glass across the room. The truth, plain and quiet as it was, seemed almost too small to satisfy the appetite for scandal that had gathered around the Hartley name. Charlotte Hale, Alina's cousin and closest friend, arrived at the estate 3 days after the dinner, having heard no fewer than 4 different accounts of what had happened and determined to hear the truth from Alina herself. She found her cousin in the garden, cutting late roses with a pair of silver shears, dressed simply, her hair loosely pinned, looking nothing at all like a woman whose marriage had just become the subject of every conversation in London. "They are saying you wept," Charlotte said, settling onto the stone bench near the rose beds. "Lady Prescott says you nearly fainted. Someone told my mother you threw a glass at his head." Alina did not look up from the roses. "I said good evening." "That is all. That is all." Charlotte studied her cousin's face for a long moment, searching for some crack beneath the calm surface, the way so many others had searched the night of the dinner itself and found nothing. She had known Alina since childhood, had grown up alongside her in the years before either of them understood what marriages of convenience truly meant, and she knew, better than most, how carefully her cousin had learned to hold her feelings behind a still, composed face. "You must be furious," Charlotte said quietly. "I am many things," Alina answered, setting a cut rose gently into the basket at her feet. "Furious is not the word I would choose." "Then what word would you choose?" Alina was quiet for a moment, considering the roses rather than her cousin's face. "Finished," she said at last. "I believe the word I would choose is finished." Charlotte did not press further, though the answer sat with her long after she left the garden that afternoon, turning over in her mind as her carriage carried her back toward the city. She had expected grief. She had expected anger, or at the very least the trembling voice of a woman trying very hard not to cry. She had not expected the quiet, settled certainty in her cousin's voice, the sense that Alina had already moved past the wound and into something else entirely, something Charlotte could not yet name. Across the city, in a townhouse rented for her by the Duke, Vivienne Sinclair was finding the aftermath of the dinner far less satisfying than she had imagined it would be. She had spent the following days waiting for word that Alina had left the estate in tears, that she had retreated to her family home in disgrace, that the marriage had cracked open the way she had been assured it eventually would. Instead, the reports that reached her, carried by friends eager to share the latest gossip, told a very different story. The Duchess had been seen at church on Sunday, composed as ever. The Duchess had visited the tenant families on the eastern edge of the estate, as she did every autumn, bringing baskets of preserves and warm wool for the coming winter. The Duchess, it seemed, was behaving exactly as she always behaved, as though nothing at all had changed. This unsettled Vivienne more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. She had built her expectations of this arrangement on a particular understanding of how it would unfold, that Alina's pride would eventually break, that she would ask for a separation, or that Reginald, freed from the quiet weight of a marriage he had never wanted, would begin to speak more seriously of the future Vivienne had allowed herself to imagine. But a scandal required 2 people willing to play their parts, and it was becoming increasingly clear to Vivienne that the Duchess had no intention of playing hers. She raised the matter with Reginald himself when he visited her townhouse later that week, finding him distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere even as he sat across from her at the small dining table she had set with what she hoped was quiet elegance. "Your wife has said nothing more," Vivienne said, watching him carefully. "Not to you." "Nothing," Reginald admitted, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. "She has not spoken of it at all. She greets me at breakfast as she always has. She asks about the estate accounts as she always has. It is as though the dinner never happened." "That troubles you." He looked up, surprised perhaps that she had read him so clearly. "It should not trouble me. I expected tears. I expected a scene I could manage, an argument I could win simply by outlasting her patience, as I always have before. I did not expect this." Vivienne reached across the table and covered his hand with her own, though something in the gesture felt, even to her, slightly less certain than it had a week earlier. "Perhaps it means she has accepted things as they are." "Perhaps," Reginald said, though his voice carried little conviction, and he did not meet her eyes again for the rest of the evening. What neither of them knew, what almost no one outside the estate's small circle of trusted staff yet knew, was that Alina had spent the days following the dinner not in grief, but in quiet, careful motion. On the morning after Charlotte's visit, she had sent a letter by private courier to Mr. Whitfield, the solicitor who had managed her family's affairs since before her marriage, requesting a private meeting at the earliest possible date. She had spent an afternoon in the estate's records room, a small, dusty chamber she had rarely visited in the 10 years of her marriage, pulling ledgers and correspondence from shelves that had not been disturbed in years. She had begun, slowly and without announcement, to understand precisely what belonged to her, what had been settled upon her at the time of her marriage, and what, despite everything Reginald might believe, remained entirely and legally beyond his reach. None of this showed in her manner. She continued to host the small autumn gatherings expected of a duchess. She continued to walk the estate grounds each morning, greeting the gardeners and the stable hands by name, as she always had. She continued to sit at the head of the dinner table each evening, across from a husband who watched her now with a wariness he had never felt toward her before. Unsettled by a calm he could not explain and increasingly uncertain of what, exactly, his wife was thinking behind that steady, unreadable face. By the end of that first week, the gossip in London's drawing rooms had begun to shift, almost imperceptibly in its tone. Where the earliest whispers had painted Alina as a woman humiliated and powerless, a new thread had begun to weave through the conversations, one that framed her instead as a woman of remarkable composure, admired even by those who had once pitied her. Lady Ashcombe, at a card party the following Thursday, remarked to her companions that she did not believe she had ever seen such dignity under such circumstances, and the sentiment, once spoken aloud, seemed to catch and spread the way certain opinions do once enough voices repeat them. This shift did not go unnoticed by Vivienne, who found herself, with growing unease, cast increasingly as the villain of a story she had believed she was entitled to shape however she pleased. Invitations that had once come easily to her began arriving with less warmth. A hostess who had welcomed her the previous season now offered only a cool nod when they crossed paths at the theater. The whispers that reached her ears no longer carried the admiring curiosity she had grown used to. They carried something closer to judgment. She said nothing of this to Reginald, not yet, though the weight of it settled over her in the quiet hours of the evening, when she sat alone in the townhouse he had provided and wondered, for the first time since their arrangement began, whether she had misjudged how this story would end. Alina, meanwhile, met with Mr. Whitfield on a gray Tuesday morning in his small, book-lined office near the Inns of Court, closing the door behind her before she spoke a single word about the true purpose of her visit. She laid before him a stack of documents she had gathered from the estate's records room, along with a question that had been forming in her mind since the night of the dinner, a question that had nothing to do with Reginald's affairs and everything to do with the future she intended to build for herself, whether her husband chose to remain in it or not. "I need to understand," she said, folding her hands neatly on the desk between them, "exactly what is mine, Mr. Whitfield, not what I have been told is mine." "What is mine, in law," regardless of anything my husband might wish to believe. Mr. Whitfield, a careful and precise man who had known Eleanor's family for 3 decades, studied her for a long moment before reaching for the documents she had placed before him. "That," he said slowly, "may take some time to determine in full, but I believe, Your Grace, that you may find the answer more favorable than you expect." Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since the night of the dinner, a small and private smile. "I rather thought I might," she said. Mr. Whitfield's office smelled of old paper and beeswax, and Eleanor found herself returning to it 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, each visit longer than the last, each conversation peeling back another layer of a marriage she had spent a decade believing she understood completely. "Your father was a careful man," Mr. Whitfield told her during their second meeting, sliding a thick folder of documents across the desk toward her. "When your marriage to the Duke was arranged, he insisted on terms that were, at the time, considered unusual. Many fathers of your generation signed their daughters' fortunes entirely into their husbands' names, trusting the marriage itself to protect the woman's interests. Your father did not trust that arrangement. He kept certain properties, certain investments, settled directly upon you, outside the reach of your husband's estate." Eleanor turned the pages slowly, her eyes moving across columns of figures and legal phrasing she had never been shown before, had never thought to ask about, because for 10 years she had simply assumed that everything belonging to her had also, by the nature of marriage, become her husband's to manage as he saw fit. She had grown up understanding that this was simply how the world worked for women of her position. She had never questioned it, not until now. "He knew this would happen," she said quietly, not quite a question. "He knew it might," Mr. Whitfield corrected gently. "He was not a man who assumed the worst of people, Your Grace, but he was a man who prepared for it nonetheless. He often said that a woman's security should never depend entirely on a man's character, however good that character might seem at the time of the marriage settlement." Eleanor thought of her father then, a quiet, methodical man who had died 6 years into her marriage, and felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but sat somewhere close to both. She had married Reginald at 19, in a match her father had negotiated carefully over the course of nearly a year, weighing land against title, fortune against family name, the way such matches were always weighed among families like theirs. She remembered very little affection in those early negotiations, and even less in the marriage itself, once the ceremony was complete. She remembered instead the slow, steady realization, over the first 2 years of her marriage, that Reginald had married her not out of any particular regard for her, but because the union secured him access to the substantial farmland that bordered his own estate, farmland that had belonged to her mother's family for 3 generations. She remembered the quiet disappointment of discovering, within months of the wedding, that her husband's attention, warm and charming as it had seemed during their brief courtship, had already begun to wander elsewhere, first to card tables and hunting parties, and eventually, as the years wore on, to women who offered him something Eleanor had never quite managed to provide: the sense that he was the center of someone's entire world. She had not been naive about his affairs, not for a long time. She had known, in the vague way a wife often knows such things without ever confirming them directly, that Reginald kept company outside their marriage. She had chosen, for years, not to confront it, telling herself that this was simply the nature of marriages like hers, that many women of her acquaintance lived with the same quiet arrangement, and that dignity meant enduring it without complaint. She had thrown herself instead into managing the estate, learning its accounts and its tenants, and its seasons with a thoroughness that had, over time, become genuine expertise. Though Reginald had never once asked her opinion on matters he considered his own to decide. What had changed, she realized now, sitting in Mr. Whitfield's book-lined office with a decade of documents spread before her, was not any single event, but an accumulation of small ones, each pressing a little harder against the quiet patience she had built her entire adult life around. The dinner had not created her decision. It had only, finally, given her the clarity to see the decision she had already been making slowly, for months. She thought back to the spring, 6 months before that dinner, when she had first begun to suspect that Reginald's latest attachment was more serious than the brief entanglements that had come before it. She had noticed the pattern of his absences shifting, longer and more frequent, and had noticed, too, the particular carelessness with which he had begun to speak of a friend, whose opinions he seemed increasingly eager to quote at dinner. She had said nothing then, had continued about her days managing the household and the estate's accounts, but something inside her had begun, quietly, to prepare. She remembered walking the eastern fields that same spring with Mr. Carrow, the estate's steward, a weathered, practical man who had worked the Hartley lands for 30 years and had watched Eleanor grow, over the course of her marriage, from a young bride uncertain of her place into a woman who understood the estate's workings better than her own husband did. "You've a good head for this, Your Grace," Carrow had told her that day, as they walked between rows of ripening wheat. "Better than most stewards I've trained, if you'll forgive the boldness of saying so." "You needn't be so careful with your words, Mr. Carrow," Eleanor had answered. "I would rather hear the truth plainly than have it softened for my comfort." "Then plainly," Carrow had said, "this estate would run twice as smoothly if His Grace left the deciding to you and confined himself to the parts he actually enjoys." Eleanor had laughed then, a real laugh, surprised by the steward's honesty, and had thought little more of the conversation at the time. But she found herself returning to it now, in Mr. Whitfield's office, turning it over alongside everything else she was learning about her own quiet capabilities she had never been permitted, in 10 years of marriage, to use fully. "There is something else you should know," Mr. Whitfield said, drawing her attention back to the present, pulling a second folder from beneath the first. "Several of the tenant farms on the eastern boundary of the estate, the ones your steward manages so carefully, were never part of the Duke's inheritance at all. They came to the marriage through your mother's family, and your father in the settlement ensured they remained legally tied to you rather than to the Camden title." Eleanor sat very still. "Reginald believes those farms belong to the estate." "Reginald," Mr. Whitfield said carefully, "may believe a great many things about his own holdings that a closer examination of the settlement papers would not entirely support. I do not say this to encourage any particular action on your part, Your Grace. I say it only so that you understand, clearly and completely, the full shape of what is actually yours." Eleanor left the solicitor's office that afternoon with the folder tucked carefully into her bag, walking out into a gray London afternoon that felt, despite the weather, brighter than any she could remember in recent months. She did not yet know precisely what she intended to do with the knowledge she was gathering. But she understood, with growing certainty, that the quiet, patient woman who had endured 10 years of a marriage built on convenience, rather than affection, was not the same woman who would decide what happened next. That evening, back at the estate, she found Reginald in his study, a glass of brandy at his elbow, staring at a letter he had clearly been reading and rereading for some time. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty she had rarely seen from him in all their years together, made her pause in the doorway. "You've been in London often these past weeks," he said, setting the letter aside. "I have business of my own to attend to," Eleanor answered simply. "What business?" "Nothing that concerns the estate's accounts," she said, which was, in its careful way, entirely true. "You needn't worry yourself over it." Reginald studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor could see him searching, the way he had searched at the dinner weeks earlier, for some crack in her composure he could press against, some sign of the wounded wife he still believed, on some level, that he was dealing with. He found nothing again, and something in his shoulders seemed to settle into a discomfort he did not quite know how to name. "Vivienne asked after you," he said finally, and Eleanor was almost certain he had not meant to say it, that the words had slipped out of some need to test her reaction one more time. "That is kind of her," Eleanor said, and turned to leave the room before he could see whether the remark had landed the way he hoped it might. She climbed the stairs to her private sitting room, the folder from Mr. Whitfield's office still in her bag, and sat for a long while at her writing desk, thinking not of Reginald and not even of Vivienne, but of her father, and of the quiet foresight he had shown a decade ago in ensuring that his daughter's future would never depend entirely on a marriage he could not fully control the outcome of. She thought, too, of Mr. Carrow's words in the wheat fields that spring, and of how much of the estate's true, steady success over the past several years had come not from Reginald's decisions, but from the quiet corrections she had made around the edges of them, the accounts she had balanced, the tenant disputes she had settled fairly, the harvest she had planned with a care her husband had never noticed because he had never thought to look. She was not, she realized, a woman who had been humiliated at a dinner table and had simply chosen, out of pride, not to show it. She was a woman who had spent 10 years quietly building the knowledge and the resources to stand entirely on her own, without fully understanding, until now, that she had been doing so all along. Outside her window, the last light of the day was fading over the estate's eastern fields, the very fields Mr. Whitfield had confirmed belonged legally to her and had always belonged to her, whatever Reginald had assumed. Eleanor watched the light go, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something loosen inside her chest that was not quite hope, not yet, but was something close enough to it that she allowed herself, for a moment, to simply sit with the feeling. Tomorrow, she would return to London and meet with Mr. Whitfield once more. There were still questions to answer, still documents to review, still a full and careful understanding to build before she made any decision she could not later undo. But for the first time since the dinner that had set all of this in motion, Eleanor hardly felt less like a woman enduring a marriage and more like a woman preparing, carefully and deliberately, for whatever came next. Vivienne Sinclair had not arrived at this arrangement by accident, and she was not, whatever the drawing rooms of London now whispered about her, a foolish woman swept along by feeling alone. She had met Reginald Hartley 2 years earlier at a summer gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance, and she had understood within the first quarter hour of conversation exactly what kind of man he was: charming, restless, easily flattered, and married to a woman he spoke of, when he spoke of her at all, with the mild irritation of a man describing an obligation rather than a partner. Vivienne had come from a family with a respectable name but a fortune that had thinned considerably over 2 generations of poor investment, and she understood, with the same clear practicality she brought to everything else, that her beauty and her wit were resources with a limited season, and that she intended to spend them wisely. She had not set out, at first, to become anyone's mistress. She had hoped in the early months of their acquaintance that Reginald might simply fall in love with her enough to make their arrangement more permanent, that his marriage to Eleanor, which he described so carelessly, might eventually dissolve under the weight of his own dissatisfaction, leaving a place open that Vivienne fully intended to fill. She had built her strategy carefully over 2 years, patient, attentive, always available when Eleanor, by Reginald's account, was too occupied with the estate's accounts or too reserved to hold his interest. The dinner had been her idea, though she had let Reginald believe otherwise, gently suggesting over the course of several conversations that perhaps it was time society understood the truth of his attachments, rather than continuing to pretend at a marriage that satisfied no one. She had imagined the evening unfolding in her favor, Eleanor's composure cracking under the public weight of the moment, Reginald's sympathy shifting decisively toward the woman who had not caused him a decade of quiet, dull disappointment. She had imagined in the weeks that followed an increasingly public courtship that would eventually make a separation, and then perhaps something more permanent, simply a matter of time. None of it had unfolded as she had planned. She sat now in the small parlor of her townhouse, 3 weeks after the dinner, reading a letter from a friend who had, with what Vivienne suspected was more relish than sympathy, informed her that she had not been invited to Lady Ashcombe's autumn ball, an event Vivienne had attended without difficulty the previous 2 years. She set the letter down and stared for a long moment at the cold, unlit fireplace across the room, feeling something she recognized, with growing discomfort, as the early edges of panic. The maid, a quiet young woman named Ruth who had served Vivienne for the better part of a year, entered to clear the breakfast tray and paused when she saw her mistress's expression. "Is something wrong, my lady?" "Nothing that concerns you," Vivienne said, more sharply than she intended, and Ruth withdrew without another word, leaving Vivienne alone once more with the letter and the uncomfortable arithmetic she had been avoiding for days. She had staked a great deal on this arrangement, more than she had ever admitted openly to Reginald, and certainly more than she would ever admit to the friends whose company she had come to depend on over the past 2 years. The townhouse she lived in belonged to him, arranged through an agent who kept her name carefully separate from any official document. The small allowance he provided covered her expenses comfortably, but left her with nothing set aside, nothing that would sustain her if the arrangement ended tomorrow. She had built her entire present, and every plan she had for her future, on the assumption that Reginald's affection for her would eventually translate into something more permanent, and she had not, until this moment, seriously considered what would happen if it did not. Reginald visited her again 2 days later, and Vivienne noticed immediately that something in his manner had shifted, a distraction that had not been there in the earlier months of their acquaintance. He spoke, when he spoke at all, of estate matters she had never heard him discuss before, a shortfall in the autumn accounts, a conversation with his own solicitor that had apparently not gone as smoothly as he expected, a growing unease about arrangements he had always assumed were settled and secure. "Is something troubling you?" Vivienne asked, watching him carefully across the small dining table. "Business," he said, waving a hand as though the matter were beneath discussion, though the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. "Nothing you need concern yourself with." Vivienne felt a small, cold flicker of recognition at those words, the same phrase, almost exactly, that she imagined Alina might have used to dismiss her own concerns for years. She said nothing of this observation aloud, but it sat with her for the rest of the evening, an uncomfortable echo she could not quite shake. "Your wife," she said instead, choosing her words carefully, "does not seem troubled by any of this." Reginald's expression darkened slightly. "No," he admitted. "She does not. Does that trouble you?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass slowly on the table, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a note Vivienne had not heard from him before, something closer to genuine uncertainty than the easy confidence he usually wore so effortlessly. "I have known Alina for 10 years, he said. "I believed I understood exactly what kind of woman she was. Quiet, dutiful, content or at least resigned to manage the household and ask few questions. I am no longer entirely certain that was ever true." Vivienne studied him across the table, and for the first time since their arrangement had begun, she felt something she had not expected to feel. A small, sharp thread of jealousy, not of Alina's beauty or her position, both of which Vivienne had long dismissed as advantages she herself could match or exceed, but of something less tangible, a settled, unshakable steadiness that Vivienne, watching Reginald's growing preoccupation with his wife's composure, was beginning to suspect she would never quite possess herself. She pushed the feeling aside as best she could, and turned the conversation toward lighter matters, an upcoming performance at the theater, a new gown she had been considering, anything that might draw Reginald's attention back to her rather than to the wife whose calm silence seemed, increasingly, to occupy far more of his thoughts than Vivienne found comfortable. But the unease did not leave her, not that evening, and not in the days that followed. She found herself, over the following 2 weeks, paying closer attention to the small signs she had previously dismissed. The way Reginald's visits had grown slightly shorter, the way his letters, once frequent and warm, had become less regular and more distracted, the way he spoke, more and more often, of matters at the estate that seemed to require his attention in ways they apparently never had before. She raised the matter, finally, with a friend she trusted, a widow named Margaret Ellery who had navigated her own share of complicated arrangements over the years, and who listened to Vivienne's concerns with the patient, unsurprised expression of a woman who had seen this particular story unfold many times before. "You believed he would leave her," Margaret said, not unkindly stirring sugar into her tea. "I believed the marriage would end on its own terms eventually," Vivienne corrected. "I did not force anything. I only made myself available for what he already wanted." "And now," Vivienne was quiet for a moment, watching the steam rise from her own cup. Now I am beginning to wonder whether the marriage he wanted to end was ever quite as fragile as he led me to believe. Margaret set down her spoon and regarded Vivienne with something that might have been sympathy or might, just as easily, have been quiet warning. "My dear," she said, "a man's complaints about his wife are rarely a reliable guide to the strength of his marriage. Men complain about many things they have no intention of losing. If I were you, I would begin considering what becomes of you if this arrangement ends before it becomes anything more permanent than it is today." The words settled over Vivienne with an unwelcome weight, and she found herself, in the days that followed, doing precisely what Margaret had suggested, however much she resented the necessity of it. She began quietly inquiring after her own family's remaining connections, testing whether any door that had closed to her in recent weeks might yet be reopened. She began, cautiously, setting aside a portion of the allowance Reginald provided, a habit of small, careful saving she had never needed before and now found herself grateful to have started, however belatedly. She did not tell Reginald of any of this. She continued to greet him with the same warmth she always had, continued to laugh at his jokes and listen attentively to his complaints, continued to play the role she had built so carefully over 2 years. But beneath the surface, something in Vivienne Sinclair had begun to shift, a slow and reluctant recognition that the story she had believed herself to be living, one where patience and beauty and careful attention would eventually be rewarded with security and standing, might not, after all, end the way she had spent 2 years assuming it would. She thought often in those weeks of the dinner itself, of the moment Alina had looked at her with that calm, unbothered expression, and said only 2 words before turning back to her soup. Vivienne had told herself at the time that the response was a mask, a brittle composure that would eventually crack. She was no longer certain that was true, and the uncertainty, more than anything else, kept her awake in the quiet hours of the night, staring at the ceiling of a townhouse that belonged, in every legal sense, to a man whose attention she could feel, slowly and unmistakably, beginning to drift somewhere she could not follow. Mr. Whitfield's small office had become, over the course of a month, a place Alina visited with the same quiet regularity she once reserved for church, though what she carried out of it each time was not comfort but clarity, sharper and more useful with every visit. By late autumn, the picture Mr. Whitfield had helped her assemble was nearly complete, and it was, as he had gently suggested it might be, far more favorable to her than she had ever imagined. The eastern farms, with their steady rents and their well-managed tenants, belonged to her outright, tied to her mother's family line through a settlement her father had insisted upon before the marriage was ever finalized. A modest but respectable townhouse in Bath, inherited from an Aunt Alina had barely known, had never been folded into the Camden estate at all, remaining quietly in her own name for the entirety of her marriage without either she or Reginald ever having reason to discuss it. And perhaps most significantly, a set of investments her father had arranged through a merchant banking house in London, modest at the time of her marriage but grown considerably over 10 years of careful management, remained entirely and legally hers, untouched by any claim the Camden title might otherwise have made upon a wife's fortune. "You understand, Your Grace," Mr. Whitfield said during one of their final meetings that season, "that none of this obligates you to any particular course of action. Many women in your position, upon learning what you have learned, choose simply to remain as they are, secure in the knowledge of what protects them without ever needing to act upon it." "I understand that," Alina said, "but I do not believe I am the kind of woman who learns something like this and does nothing with it." Mr. Whitfield allowed himself a small, approving smile, the first she had seen from him in their many meetings. "No," he agreed, "I do not believe you are either." What Alina had not yet decided, even as her understanding of her own resources grew clearer with each passing week, was precisely what shape her next steps should take. She had no wish for the kind of public spectacle that would delight the very same gossips who had spent the past month whispering about her marriage. She had no interest in a bitter, drawn-out battle over property and title that would consume years and leave both her and Reginald diminished by the fight, however it ended. What she wanted, she realized slowly over the course of that autumn, was something quieter and, in its own way, far more complete. The ability to simply step away from a marriage that had never truly been a partnership, taking with her everything that was legally and rightfully hers, and to build, on the foundation of the family estate in Bath and the Eastern farms and the investments her father had so carefully protected, a life she governed entirely by her own judgment. She began, with Mr. Whitfield's careful guidance, to prepare for exactly that. The Eastern farms required the most immediate attention, and Alina spent several long mornings that autumn walking the fields with Mr. Caro, reviewing the tenant agreements, the harvest records, the small disputes and improvements that had accumulated over years of quiet management. She found, to her genuine pleasure, that Mr. Caro had kept meticulous records of everything, understanding perhaps better than anyone else on the estate exactly how much of the land's steady success had come from Alina's own decisions rather than any direction from Reginald. "You'll be wanting to formalize your own steward, then," Caro observed one gray morning, as they stood at the edge of a field being prepared for winter wheat. "Someone answering only to you, once matters are settled properly." Alina looked at him, surprised by how directly he had spoken to something she had not yet said aloud to anyone but her solicitor. "You've guessed my intentions, Mr. Caro. I've watched you manage this land for 10 years, Your Grace, more carefully than His Grace ever has. It doesn't take much guessing to see where matters are heading, only eyes that are paying attention." He paused, turning to look at her directly. "I'd be honored to serve as that steward if you'll have me. I've no particular loyalty to the Camden title. My loyalty has always been to the land, and to whoever tends it well." Alina felt something warm and unexpected settle in her chest at his words, a small confirmation that the quiet, careful work of the past 10 years had not gone entirely unnoticed, even if the one person whose notice she had once hoped for most had never thought to offer it. "I would be glad to have you, Mr. Caro," she said, "whenever the time comes." The townhouse in Bath required less immediate attention, though Alina arranged, through a trusted agent recommended by Mr. Whitfield, to have it inspected and prepared, quietly and without drawing attention, for the possibility of her own residence there in the coming months. She had visited the house only twice before, both times briefly, during the early years of her marriage, and she found herself, reviewing the agent's reports on its condition and its modest but well-kept gardens, imagining for the first time in a decade a home that would be entirely her own, shaped by her own preferences rather than inherited alongside a husband's title. The investments proved the most complex matter of all, requiring several meetings not only with Mr. Whitfield, but with the banking house that had managed them on her father's instructions for over a decade. Alina found herself, in these meetings, drawing on an aptitude for figures and careful reasoning that she had developed almost entirely through her years of managing the estate's household accounts, a skill Reginald had never once acknowledged, let alone valued, though it had quietly kept the Camden estate's domestic affairs running smoothly for the entirety of their marriage. Mr. Aldous, the senior partner at the banking house, a precise and somewhat formal man who had corresponded with Alina's father for many years before his death, seemed genuinely surprised by the sharpness of her questions during their first meeting, and by the third, he had stopped explaining matters to her with the careful simplicity he might have used with a client less accustomed to financial reasoning. "Your father would be pleased, Your Grace," he told her near the end of their final autumn meeting, "to see how thoroughly you have come to understand these matters." "My father was a careful man," Alina said. "I am only now beginning to understand how careful." She left that meeting with a clearer picture than ever of the resources available to her, and with a growing sense, quiet but unmistakable, that she was no longer simply reacting to the humiliation of that autumn dinner, but building, with real and deliberate purpose, toward a future she intended to shape entirely on her own terms. None of this preparation was visible to the household, or to the wider circle of society that continued, with undiminished interest, to speculate about the state of the Hartley marriage. Alina continued to preside over the estate's daily affairs, with the same quiet efficiency she always had. She continued to host the modest gatherings expected of the season, continued to attend church each Sunday, continued to greet Reginald at breakfast with the same measured courtesy she had shown him for years, though something in her manner, subtle enough that only those who knew her best could sense it, had grown steadier, more certain, less like a woman enduring her circumstances, and more like a woman quietly preparing to leave them behind. Charlotte visited again in late autumn, finding Alina in the estate's small library reviewing a stack of papers that she quickly, though not urgently, set aside when her cousin entered. "You are planning something," Charlotte said, settling into the chair across from her with the directness of a lifelong friend. "You have that look about you. You had it when we were girls, right before you did something our governess had expressly forbidden." Alina allowed herself a small smile, the first genuinely amused expression Charlotte had seen from her in weeks. "I am not doing anything forbidden, Charlotte." "But you are doing something." Alina considered how much to say, weighing, as she had weighed so many things that autumn, the value of careful discretion against the comfort of confiding in someone she trusted completely. "I am learning," she said finally, "exactly what belongs to me and exactly what I am capable of, separate from anything that belongs to my husband. I have not decided everything yet, but I am no longer willing to remain uncertain about my own position simply because it has always been easier not to ask the questions." Charlotte studied her for a long moment, and whatever she saw in Alina's face seemed to satisfy whatever concern had brought her to ask the question in the first place. "Good," she said simply. "It is well past time." The two women spent the remainder of the afternoon in quiet, comfortable conversation, and Alina found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, speaking with genuine openness about the years of her marriage, the slow accumulation of small disappointments, the quiet loneliness of a partnership that had never truly been one. She did not cry as she spoke, though the conversation carried real weight, and Charlotte listened with the patient attentiveness of someone who had long suspected these feelings existed beneath her cousin's composed surface, and had simply been waiting for the moment Alina was ready to voice them. "What will you do?" Charlotte asked eventually, "once you have decided?" "I do not yet know precisely," Alina admitted, "but I know it will be mine to decide entirely for the first time since I was 19 years old. That, I think, is enough of an answer for now." As winter approached, and the estate's fields lay fallow beneath the first frosts of the season, Alina's quiet preparations continued steadily, unseen by nearly everyone around her, gathering, week by week, into something that would eventually prove far more consequential than any single dinner or any single humiliation ever could have been on its own. She was no longer simply the Duchess who had responded to her husband's mistress with two calm words at a dinner table. She was becoming, slowly and deliberately, a woman who understood, more completely than she ever had before, exactly what she was capable of building for herself, and exactly how little of her future needed to depend any longer on a marriage that had given her a title but very little else worth keeping. The letter that finally forced Reginald Hartley to confront the true state of his affairs arrived on a cold morning in early winter, delivered by his own solicitor, Mr. Pratt, a man Reginald had employed for nearly 15 years and had, until that morning, always found reassuringly deferential. The letter concerned a loan Reginald had taken against a portion of the estate's northern acreage 2 years earlier, funds he had used, though he had never fully explained this to anyone, including himself, to cover a string of gambling debts and the steady expenses of maintaining Vivienne's townhouse and the small allowance that came with it. He had assumed, when he signed the original papers, that the loan would be easily managed against the estate's overall income, a temporary measure he would repay comfortably within a year or two. He had not anticipated a poor harvest the following autumn, nor the slow decline in wool prices that had quietly eaten into the estate's margins over the past 18 months, nor the growing difficulty of borrowing further against land that had already been pledged once. Mr. Pratt sat across from him in the study that morning, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man delivering news he knows will not be welcome. The lender has requested a formal accounting of the estate's total holdings, Your Grace, as a condition of extending the terms. This is not unusual practice, but it does require a complete review, and I am afraid the review has revealed certain complications. What complications? Reginald asked, though something in his chest had already begun to tighten in anticipation of the answer. Several of the properties listed in the estate's original inventory, Mr. Pratt said carefully, appear, upon closer examination of the marriage settlement papers, to be held not by the Camden title, but by the Duchess directly, in her own name, as arranged by her father at the time of your marriage. This includes the Eastern farms, which represent a significant portion of the estate's annual rental income, as well as certain investments that had, until now, been assumed to fall under the general umbrella of the estate's assets. Reginald stared at him for a long moment, certain he had misunderstood. That cannot be correct. Those farms have been managed as part of the Camden estate for the entirety of my marriage. Managed, perhaps, Mr. Pratt said, but not owned, Your Grace. The distinction, I am afraid, matters a great deal in the current circumstances. The lender's terms depend upon the estate's total holdings serving as security for the loan. If a significant portion of those holdings are not, in fact, legally part of the estate, the terms will need to be renegotiated, likely at considerably less favorable rates than we had anticipated. Reginald sat in silence for a long moment, turning over a decade of assumptions he had never once thought to question. Assumptions about his estate, about his marriage, about a wife he had always believed content to leave such matters entirely in his hands. He thought of the Eastern farms, of the steady, reliable income they had always provided, income he had spent for years without ever once considering where, precisely, it originated or under whose ultimate authority it fell. He had simply assumed, the way he assumed most things about his marriage, that everything belonging to Alina had become, upon their wedding, his to direct as he saw fit. "Does she know this?" he asked finally. Mr. Pratt's expression remained carefully neutral. "I could not say, Your Grace, but given that the settlement papers themselves make the arrangement quite clear, I would think it likely that the Duchess, or her own solicitor, has been aware of the distinction for some time, even if it was never actively discussed between you." Reginald sat with that thought long after Mr. Pratt had gathered his papers and departed, staring at the fire in his study as the afternoon light faded outside the window. He thought of Alina's frequent trips to London over the past 2 months, trips she had described only vaguely as business of her own, trips he had not questioned closely, because he had never truly imagined his quiet, dutiful wife capable of any business that might concern him. He thought of the calm, unreadable composure she had shown at the dinner weeks earlier, and in every interaction since, a composure he had assumed at the time, reflected simple resignation or wounded pride carefully concealed. He began to wonder, with a growing unease he did not enjoy, whether he had misread that composure entirely. He did not confront her that evening. He told himself he needed time to understand the full scope of the situation before raising it with her, though the truth, had he been honest with himself, was closer to a reluctance to discover just how much his wife might already know, and just how little control over his own circumstances he might actually possess. The following weeks brought little relief. Mr. Pratt's continued review of the estate's finances revealed further complications. The modest fortune Alina had brought to the marriage, which Reginald had assumed, without ever confirming, had long since been absorbed into the general accounts of the Camden estate, remained, in fact, entirely separate, managed through a banking house that answered to Alina and her solicitor alone. The townhouse in Bath, which Reginald had vaguely remembered as some minor property inherited by his wife years ago, had never been folded into the estate's holdings at all. The full picture, once assembled, was sobering in a way Reginald had not anticipated. A significant portion of what he had always considered the Camden estate's total wealth belonged, legally and unambiguously, to his wife, and had belonged to her, entirely separate from his own authority, for the whole of their 10-year marriage. What remained under his direct control, once the true accounting was complete, was a title of considerable prestige attached to an estate carrying more debt and fewer reliable assets than he had ever allowed himself to believe. He raised the matter, finally, with Vivienne, though he found himself sitting across from her in the small parlor of her townhouse, reluctant to share the full weight of what he had learned. "You seem troubled," Vivienne observed, watching him with the careful attention she had developed over the past difficult weeks, attention that had grown sharper, not softer, as her own concerns about the arrangement's future had deepened. "The estate's finances are more complicated than I had realized," Reginald admitted, which was, he told himself, technically true even if it fell well short of the full truth. Complicated how? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Vivienne saw something she had not expected to see from him. Genuine uncertainty, the kind that suggested a man who had built his entire sense of security on assumptions he was only now discovering had never been entirely accurate. "There are debts," he said finally, "against the estate, and certain properties I had long assumed belonged to me outright have turned out to belong legally to a liener." Vivienne set down her tea, absorbing this information with a careful stillness that concealed, for the moment, the sharp calculation already running behind her eyes. How significant a portion? "Significant enough," Reginald said, and something in his tone made clear that he did not wish to discuss the matter further. Vivienne did not press him that evening, but the conversation sat with her long after he had gone, turning itself over alongside the growing unease she had been carrying for weeks about the true security of her own position. She had built her expectations of this arrangement on the assumption that Reginald possessed both the title and the fortune necessary to eventually make good on the future she had allowed herself to imagine. The possibility that his fortune might be considerably less substantial than she had believed, and that a growing share of his family's actual wealth belonged, in fact, to the wife he seemed increasingly unable to predict, unsettled her in ways she found difficult to fully articulate even to herself. She thought with an uncomfortable clarity of Margaret's warning weeks earlier, about considering what became of her if this arrangement ended before it grew into anything more permanent. She had told herself, at the time, that the warning was overly cautious, the wisdom of a widow grown too accustomed to disappointment to trust in anyone's good fortune. She was no longer certain the caution had been misplaced. Reginald, for his part, spent the following weeks in a state of quiet, mounting anxiety he took great care to conceal from nearly everyone around him, though he found it increasingly difficult to conceal from himself. He reviewed the estate's accounts late into the night, searching for solutions that grew harder to find the more thoroughly he understood the true shape of his circumstances. He considered, briefly, and with real discomfort, whether he might approach a liener directly and ask for her assistance in stabilizing the estate's finances, an idea he dismissed almost as quickly as it arose, unable to imagine how he might raise such a request without acknowledging, plainly, how badly he had misjudged both his own affairs and the wife he had spent a decade underestimating. He watched her instead, across the breakfast table each morning, across the dinner table each evening, searching her calm, composed face for some sign of what she knew and what she intended to do with the knowledge. He found nothing, as he had found nothing since the night of the dinner, and the not knowing had begun to weigh on him more heavily than any single confrontation could have. It was Mr. Caro, of all people, who finally gave him a glimpse of what was coming, though the steward had not intended to reveal anything at all. Reginald encountered him on the estate's eastern boundary one gray afternoon, reviewing what appeared to be a fresh set of tenant agreements with a precision that struck Reginald, watching from a distance, as unusually formal for routine seasonal business. "New arrangements, Caro?" Reginald asked, approaching the steward with what he hoped was casual interest. Caro looked up, and something careful crossed his weathered face before he answered. "Just reviewing matters for the coming year, Your Grace. Nothing that need concern you." The phrase landed with an unpleasant familiarity, the same words Reginald had used so many times with a liener, now returned to him from a man he had employed for years, and had never once considered capable of keeping secrets on anyone's behalf but the Camden titles. He said nothing further, but he walked back toward the main house that afternoon with a growing certainty that whatever his wife was planning had already progressed further than he had allowed himself to imagine, and that the ground beneath his own feet, both financial and otherwise, had grown considerably less stable than he had spent 10 years assuming it would always remain. The invitation to Lady Ashcombe's winter gathering arrived at the Hartley estate in the second week of December, and Alina accepted it with the same calm courtesy she had shown every social obligation since the autumn dinner that had set so much in motion. She had no particular wish to attend, but she understood, with the same practical clarity she now brought to nearly every decision, that a public appearance, calm and unremarkable, would serve her far better in the coming weeks than any prolonged absence that might invite further speculation before she was ready to act. Reginald arrived separately, having spent the earlier part of the evening at his club, and Alina noticed, the moment he entered the crowded drawing-room, that something in his manner had changed in the weeks since their last real conversation. He looked, for the first time in their marriage, genuinely uncertain of his footing, glancing toward her more frequently than he ever had before, as though searching for some sign of what she intended, some crack in her composure he might finally read. He approached her near the end of the evening, drawing her gently away from a cluster of guests toward a quieter corner of the room, and Alina allowed it, curious, in her own careful way, to hear what he had finally worked up the resolve to say. "Alina," he began, his voice lower and less certain than she had heard it in years, "I believe we ought to speak plainly. You and I, there has been a great deal left unsaid between us these past months." "I agree," Alina said simply and waited. Reginald hesitated, clearly having prepared for a different response, one that might have opened more easily into whatever speech he had rehearsed. "I have been foolish," he said finally. "About Vivienne. About a great many things, I think, though I am only now beginning to understand the full extent of it. I would like very much for us to find our way back to something resembling a proper marriage, Alina. I believe I have not given you the consideration you deserved, and I would like the chance to correct that." Alina studied her husband's face for a long moment, searching, with genuine curiosity rather than any lingering hope, for the sincerity beneath his words. She found, she believed, a measure of real discomfort in him, a man confronting consequences he had not anticipated and reaching, perhaps for the first time in their marriage, for a solution that did not simply assume her continued patience. But she found, too, an unmistakable thread of self-interest running beneath the apology. A man who had discovered his fortune was considerably less secure than he believed, and who now, faced with that discovery, found his wife's steady composure considerably more valuable than he ever had before. "I appreciate you saying so," she said finally, her voice calm and even, carrying none of the sharpness the moment might have justified. "But I do not believe a marriage can be repaired simply because one party has discovered, rather late, that the other has more to offer than he previously accounted for." Reginald's expression shifted, uncertainty giving way to something closer to alarm. "That is not why I am saying this, Alina." "Is it not?" Alina asked, without any particular heat in the question. "I have known for some months now, Reginald, exactly what belongs to me and what does not. I imagine you have only recently learned the same. I do not say this to accuse you of anything beyond what you have already, in your own way, admitted tonight. But I would ask you to consider honestly whether this conversation would be taking place at all if your solicitor had not recently discovered the true state of the estate's finances." Reginald said nothing, and his silence, more than any words could have, confirmed everything Alina had already suspected. "I intend," she continued, her voice remaining calm and level, "to relocate to the property in Bath that belonged to my aunt, effective at the start of the new year. I will take with me the assets that are legally mine, including the Eastern farms, which Mr. Carow has already agreed to continue managing under my direct authority. I do not intend to seek a public separation, nor do I intend to create any further scandal beyond what has already occurred. I simply intend to live, from this point forward, according to my own judgment rather than yours." A few guests nearby, drawn by something in the tone of the conversation despite its quiet volume, had begun to glance toward them, and Lady Ashcombe herself, standing not far off, had grown noticeably attentive despite her efforts to appear otherwise engaged in conversation with a nearby group. Elinor was aware of this attention and did not lower her voice to avoid it, understanding, with the same clear-eyed practicality that had guided her these past months, that a certain degree of public witness might serve her purposes as well as anything else. "You cannot simply leave," Reginald said, his voice tightening with a note of genuine alarm now. "You are my wife. Whatever the settlement papers say about specific properties, you remain the Duchess of Camden. Society will not accept." "Society," Elinor interrupted gently, "has already accepted a great deal these past months, Reginald. I do not believe my quiet relocation to a property that belongs entirely to me will trouble anyone half so much as the dinner you hosted in your own home this autumn." The remark landed with quiet precision, and Reginald had no ready answer for it. He glanced around the room, clearly aware now of the small audience their conversation had gathered, and something in his posture shifted, the confident ease he had worn for so many years replaced by a visible, uncomfortable awareness of how thoroughly the balance between them had shifted. "I had hoped," he said finally, his voice quieter now, "that we might find a way forward together." "I understand that," Elinor said, and for the first time that evening something genuinely gentle entered her voice, not affection exactly, but a kind of honest acknowledgement of the man before her, flawed and frightened and only now beginning to understand what he had spent a decade taking for granted. "But I have spent 10 years finding my way according to your judgment, Reginald, often without complaint, because I believed that was simply what was expected of me. I am not angry with you for the dinner, not truly, not anymore. In many ways, I believe I owe you a strange kind of gratitude for it, because it was that evening, more than any other, that finally made clear to me how much of my own life I had left unclaimed." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a quiet finality that left no room for further negotiation. "I wish you well, genuinely. I hope you find whatever it is you are truly looking for, whether that turns out to be Vivienne or something else entirely. But I will not be finding it alongside you any longer." She left him standing in the corner of Lady Ashcombe's drawing room, walking back into the main gathering with the same calm, unhurried grace she had carried into the dinner months earlier, greeting acquaintances warmly as she passed, declining with polite good humor the curious glances that followed her across the room. By the time she called for her carriage an hour later, the story of what had transpired between the Duke and Duchess of Camden at Lady Ashcombe's winter gathering had already begun its own quiet journey through the room, whispered from guest to guest with the same eager fascination that had carried the story of the dinner itself through London weeks earlier. But the tenor of the whispers, Elinor noted with quiet satisfaction as she settled into her carriage for the ride home, had changed considerably since autumn. Where once the talk had carried an undercurrent of pity, tonight it carried something closer to admiration, a growing recognition among the very people who had once speculated over her humiliation that the Duchess of Camden had, in fact, never truly been humiliated at all, only patient, and that her patience, it now seemed clear to everyone watching, had finally run its course on her own terms rather than anyone else's. Reginald remained at the gathering long after Elinor's departure, accepting the careful, sympathetic glances of acquaintances who did not quite know what to say to a duke whose wife had, by all appearances, just informed him in the middle of a crowded drawing-room that she intended to leave him. He drank more than he should have that evening, and when he finally returned to the estate well past midnight, he found the house quiet, Elinor already retired to her private chambers, the door closed against him in a way that felt, for the first time in 10 years of marriage, entirely and permanently final. The move to Bath took place in the first week of January, under a pale winter sky that Elinor found, despite the season's usual bleakness, unexpectedly beautiful as her carriage carried her away from the Camden estate for what she understood, with quiet certainty, would be the last time she called it home. She had spent the final weeks of December completing the arrangements Mr. Whitfield had helped her prepare so carefully over the preceding months. Mr. Carrow had formally accepted his position as steward of the Eastern farms, now managed entirely under Aline's direct authority, and had already begun drawing up plans for the spring planting with an enthusiasm Aline found genuinely moving. A man clearly relieved to finally answer to someone who valued his judgment as thoroughly as she had come to value it over the years. The investments Mr. Aldous had managed so carefully on her behalf were transferred into accounts entirely separate from anything connected to the Camden title, and the townhouse in Bath, freshly prepared according to Aline's own instructions, awaited her arrival with a warmth and readiness that felt, to Aline, like a home in a way the grand halls of the Hartley estate never quite had. Charlotte had insisted on accompanying her for the first several weeks of the transition, and the two cousins spent their early days in Bath settling into a rhythm that felt, to Aline, remarkably like happiness, though she had grown cautious, over the difficult months of the previous year, about naming her own feelings too quickly or too certainly. They walked the town's elegant crescents each morning, visited the assembly rooms in the evenings, and spent long afternoons in Aline's small but comfortable study, where she had begun, with genuine enthusiasm, to review proposals for expanding the Eastern farm's modest wool trade into a more ambitious venture, one that would answer to no one's judgment but her own. The story of the Duchess of Camden's quiet departure had, of course, traveled through London's drawing rooms with the same eager speed as every previous chapter of the tale. But Aline found, reading occasional letters from friends who kept her informed of the gossip without her needing to seek it out herself, that the story had settled by late winter into something closer to legend than scandal. She had become, in the retelling that spread across the season, less a wronged wife and more a figure of quiet, formidable competence, a woman who had endured public humiliation without complaint, and had then, with careful and deliberate patience, built an entirely independent life on the strength of her own judgment and resources. Reginald, meanwhile, remained at the Camden estate through that difficult winter, navigating the consequences of a fortune considerably diminished by the departure of assets he had never truly owned in the first place. Mr. Pratt worked with him through the following months to renegotiate the estate's outstanding debts on terms far less favorable than those he had once taken for granted. And the estate itself, without Aline's quiet, steady management running beneath its surface, began to show, within a single season, the kind of small but noticeable decline that comes from the absence of careful attention rather than any single dramatic failure. Vivienne Sinclair did not remain in Reginald's life much past the turn of the year. She had watched, over the difficult weeks following Aline's departure, as his attention grew increasingly consumed by financial worry rather than romantic devotion, and she understood, with the same clear practicality that had guided her from the beginning of their arrangement, that the future she had once imagined for herself alongside a wealthy duke had never truly existed in the way she had hoped it might. She ended the arrangement herself, in early spring, choosing her own timing rather than waiting to see whether Reginald might eventually make that choice for her, and she left London society for a time, quietly rebuilding her prospects with the same careful attention she had once devoted to securing Reginald's affection, though this time directed toward interests entirely her own. Aline heard of Vivienne's departure from Reginald's life through one of Charlotte's letters, delivered on an ordinary spring morning as Aline sat in her garden reviewing the season's first accounts from the Eastern farms. She read the news with a mild, distant interest that surprised her slightly, realizing, as she folded the letter and set it aside, that she felt no particular satisfaction in it, and no particular sympathy either. Vivienne had simply ceased, over the preceding months, to occupy any meaningful place in Aline's own understanding of her life, a distant figure from a chapter that had already closed. The wool venture Aline had begun developing that winter proved, by summer, to be a genuine success, expanding beyond the Eastern farm's original modest trade into contracts with several mills that had previously done business only with much larger estates. Mr. Caro oversaw the practical operations with the same steady competence he had always shown, while Alina herself handled the negotiations and accounts with a sharpness that surprised even Mr. Aldous, who remarked, during one of their regular meetings that summer, that he had rarely seen a client, of any gender, grasp the finer points of commercial negotiation so quickly. "My father would tell you I simply had a good teacher in him," Alina said, though she allowed herself, in saying it, a small measure of genuine pride in what she had built entirely on her own over the past year. It was at a summer gathering in Bath, nearly 8 months after her departure from the Camden estate, that Alina found herself, quite by chance, in the same room as Reginald for the first time since that winter evening at Lady Ashcombe's gathering. He had traveled to Bath on business connected to the estate's continuing financial recovery, and neither of them had expected to encounter the other at a modest garden party hosted by a mutual acquaintance neither had realized they shared. He looked, Alina noted with the same calm, unhurried attention she brought to nearly everything now, older than she remembered, the confident ease that had once defined him worn thin by a year of consequences he had never anticipated. He approached her carefully, clearly uncertain of his welcome, and she allowed him the courtesy of a polite, unhurried conversation, the kind two acquaintances with a complicated history might share at a garden party neither had particularly wished to attend together. "You look well," he said finally, when the smaller pleasantries had run their course. "Bath suits you." "It does," Alina agreed simply. "The farms," he began, then hesitated, clearly uncertain whether the subject remained his to raise. "I have heard they are doing remarkably well." "They are," Alina said, and something in her tone, calm and entirely without malice, made clear that she felt no particular need to elaborate further for his benefit. Reginald nodded, accepting the boundary without argument, a small but noticeable change from the man who had once assumed every conversation would eventually bend toward his own comfort. "I am glad," he said, and seemed to genuinely mean it, whatever complicated feelings lingered beneath the simple words. "I have thought often this past year about what I failed to see in you for so long, Alina. I do not say this to ask anything of you. I understand that chapter is closed. I only wished you to know that I understand it now, even if I understood it far too late to matter." Alina studied him for a long moment, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt neither anger nor lingering sorrow in his words, only a kind of settled peace, the particular peace that comes from having built, entirely through one's own effort, a life sturdy enough to hold steady regardless of what any other person's regret might or might not mean. "I appreciate you saying so," she said, echoing without quite meaning to, the same words she had spoken to him at Lady Ashcombe's gathering nearly a year earlier. And then with a small, genuine smile that carried no bitterness at all, she added, "Good evening, Reginald." She turned and walked back toward the garden's far end, where Charlotte was waiting with 2 glasses of lemonade and a curious expression, clearly eager to hear what had passed between them. Alina did not look back to see how Reginald received her final words, though she understood with quiet certainty that he would recognize them, the same 2 words that had once seemed, to everyone watching that autumn dinner nearly a year earlier, like the composed surrender of a humiliated wife, and that now, spoken freely in a summer garden by a woman who owed her circumstances to no one but herself, carried an entirely different meaning altogether. She had said good evening at that dinner table because she had already, in the quiet corners of her own mind, begun the long process of letting go of a marriage that had never truly served her. She said it again now, in the golden light of a Bath summer evening, because she had finished that process completely, and because she had discovered, over the course of a single remarkable year, exactly how much of her own life had been waiting, patiently, for her to finally claim it. The story of the Duke and the Duchess of Camden would continue to be told, for seasons afterward in the drawing-rooms of London, though the tale had long since stopped being a story of humiliation, and had become instead, in the retelling that mattered most, a story of quiet, patient strength of a woman who had faced public disgrace with unshakable composure, and had then, with careful determination, built an entire life more solid and more genuinely her own than any title had ever given her. Society, in the end, never forgot the dinner where the Duke had introduced his mistress, and his wife had simply said good evening. But what society remembered most in the years that followed was not the humiliation of that single moment, but everything Alina Hartley had quietly built afterward, on the strength of 2 calm words and a decade of patience finally, completely spent. 2 years after her move to Bath, Alina Hartley received a letter that would have surprised the woman she had been at the start of that difficult autumn, though it surprised her very little now. It came from a merchant named Henry Calloway, a man she had met the previous spring through her expanding wool trade, who had built his own modest fortune through careful shipping ventures along the southern coast, and who had, over the course of several business meetings that gradually grew warmer and less formal, begun courting her with a patience and genuine respect Alina had never once experienced in her first marriage. Henry was not a duke, nor did he hold any title beyond the respect his own hard work had earned him among the merchants and traders of the coast. He was, Alina found, considerably more interested in her opinions than Reginald had ever been, often deferring to her judgment on matters of business with a trust that felt, to Alina, both unfamiliar and quietly wonderful. Their courtship unfolded slowly, built on long conversations about trade routes and wool prices, and the small, ordinary pleasures of shared meals and quiet evenings, rather than the grand, performative gestures Alina had once mistaken, as a much younger woman, for genuine affection. She did not rush toward marriage a second time. She had learned, over the painful and illuminating months following that autumn dinner, precisely how much of her own worth had nothing to do with any man's regard for her, and she approached Henry's growing attachment with the same careful, deliberate consideration she now brought to every important decision in her life. When she finally accepted his proposal, nearly 3 years after her departure from the Camden estate, it was with a clear-eyed understanding, shared openly between them, that their marriage would be built on partnership rather than convenience, on mutual respect rather than the quiet imbalance she had endured for a decade before. Charlotte stood beside her at the small, unpretentious wedding held in the gardens of the Bath townhouse, and Mr. Carow, who had traveled from the eastern farms for the occasion, remarked afterward that he had never seen Alina look quite so unguarded in all the years he had known her. Reginald Hartley's fortunes, meanwhile, continued their slow, steady decline through those same years, the Camden estate never quite recovering the steady prosperity it had known under Alina's quiet management. He remarried eventually, a match arranged, much as his first had been, along lines of convenience rather than affection, though those who observed the union noted a subdued caution in Reginald's manner that had not been present in his younger years, the visible caution of a man who had learned, through painful and public consequence, not to take his own good fortune for granted a second time. He and Alina exchanged occasional, polite correspondence over the years that followed, brief letters concerning matters of mutual acquaintance, or the rare practical question that still arose between 2 people who had once shared a decade of marriage, however imperfect. There was no bitterness in these exchanges, and no lingering hope on either side of anything more. They had become, in the end, 2 people who had built entirely separate lives from the wreckage of a marriage neither of them had truly chosen, and who had found, each in their own way, a kind of peace in the distance between them. Vivienne Sinclair's own path, which Alina followed only distantly through the occasional remark from mutual acquaintances, took her eventually away from London entirely, to a quieter life in the northern counties, where she had, by all accounts, made a respectable second match with a widowed gentleman of modest but comfortable means. Whatever ambitions had once driven her toward the Camden fortune seemed, in time, to settle into something calmer, and Alina, hearing the news years later, felt only a distant, generous hope that Vivienne had found whatever peace she had been searching for all along, however different it looked from the future she had once imagined for herself. The eastern farms, under Alina's continued direction, and Mr. Carow's steady management, grew over the following decade into one of the most respected wool-producing estates along the southern trade routes, their reputation built not on inherited title, but on the careful, patient reputation Alina herself had built, negotiation by negotiation, season by season. Young women of her acquaintance, daughters of families she had come to know through her business dealings, began seeking her counsel on matters of both commerce and marriage, drawn by the quiet example of a woman who had faced public humiliation and had transformed it, through patience rather than bitterness, into an entirely self-made success. Alina found, in the years of her second marriage, a genuine and steady happiness that surprised her at times with its simplicity. She and Henry built a life together in Bath, expanding their combined trade interests along the coast, raising two children who grew up watching their mother negotiate contracts and manage accounts with the same natural authority she brought to every corner of her life. She told them, when they were old enough to understand it, the story of the dinner that had once seemed, to everyone watching, like the lowest moment of her life. And she told them, too, the truth she had come to understand so thoroughly in the years that followed, that the moment had never truly been about humiliation at all, but about the quiet, unshakable strength a person could discover in themselves once they stopped waiting for someone else to grant them the life they deserved. She thought, occasionally, of that autumn evening, of the candles burning low in the great hall, of Vivienne Sinclair's plum-colored gown catching the candlelight, of Reginald's uncertain expression as he waited for a reaction that never came in the shape he expected. She thought of the two words she had spoken, calm and unhurried, and of everything those two words had quietly set in motion over the years that followed. She did not regret the pain of that period, difficult as it had been, because she understood with the clarity of hindsight that the pain had been the beginning of something far more valuable than the comfortable, quiet unhappiness she had endured for the decade before it. On the 10th anniversary of that dinner, Alina sat in the garden of her Bath home, now considerably grown and cared for over the years, watching her two children play near the roses she had planted herself, and found herself thinking, with genuine gratitude rather than any lingering sorrow, of her own father, and of the careful foresight he had shown in protecting her future long before she had understood herself how much she would eventually need that protection. She thought, too, of Mr. Carrow's steady loyalty, of Mr. Whitfield's patient guidance, of Charlotte's unwavering friendship, and of Henry's quiet, genuine partnership, all the people who had helped her build, piece by careful piece, the life she now lived so fully. She had never sought the fame that followed her story through London's drawing rooms in the years after that dinner. The way her name became, among certain circles, a kind of quiet legend, invoked whenever a woman found herself facing public humiliation with more composure than anyone expected of her. She had built her life instead for herself, for the quiet satisfaction of her own accomplishments, rather than for the approval or admiration of a society that had once been so eager to pity her, and had later become just as eager to celebrate her. What remained most true, Alina reflected that afternoon in her garden, was not the drama of that single dinner, nor the scandal that had followed it, nor even the eventual triumph of her independence, but the simple, steady truth she had discovered somewhere in the quiet months between. That a person's worth had never depended on another person's regard for them, however much the world sometimes insisted otherwise, and that the strongest response to humiliation was rarely anger or grand gesture, but the patient, determined work of building something entirely one's own, brick by careful brick, until the humiliation itself became nothing more than a small, distant memory, overshadowed entirely by everything that had grown in its place. The sun set slowly over the Bath garden that evening, gold light settling over the roses and the quiet laughter of her children, and Alina Hartley Calloway, no longer a duchess but entirely, completely herself, watched it fall with the same calm, unshakable peace that had carried her, one steady step at a time, from a humiliating dinner table to a life built entirely on her own quiet, patient strength.